She was once a queen whose voice could summon armies and whose smile carried the weight of a crown. Yet on a late September afternoon in 1213, Gertrude of Merania was no longer seen as a queen. She was prey, surrounded by men who should have bowed to her. She was dragged from the safety of her hall into the raw air of the forest. The sound was not of trumpets or lutes, but of steel unsheathed and voices howling like hunters closing in on their quarry. Imagine the figure of a woman in royal silk, torn and stained with dirt, stumbling as her crown slips from her head. No guards rushed to her side. No courtiers raised their hands in protest. In that silence, she became an animal cornered, her terror echoing against stone walls that once rang with celebration. The chronicles tell us her cries were not answered. They describe a queen who faced not a dignified death, but a killing meant to humiliate, a slaughter meant to erase her very presence from Hungary's throne. And yet the question lingers like smoke. How does a woman born to power, linked to some of the most influential families of Europe, end as nothing more than prey in her own kingdom? This is the story of Gertrude of Merania, the queen who was hunted like a beast. Her rise was dazzling, her reign controversial, and her end so brutal that history itself recoiled. But within the savagery lies a tale of politics, betrayal, and silence. Silence from a king, silence from a court, silence that sealed her fate. Stay with me until the end, for only then will the full weight of her tragedy unfold before you. And if you wish to walk deeper into the shadows of history, subscribe now. More stories like Gertrude's wait in the dark, and they will not let you look away. Gertrude of Merania was born into a family whose power stretched like a chain of fortresses across Europe. The Index Merania name carried the weight of bishops, dukes, and counts. In their halls, prayers echoed beside the sound of armored boots. It was a world that taught its daughters early that their lives were not their own. They were to be given as symbols, exchanged for alliances, bound to crowns they had never seen. In this house of stone and ritual, Gertrude grew as a flame among quieter lights. She carried herself with a poise that startled even her tutors. Her voice was calm but never timid, her gaze direct, as if she expected the world to bend before her certainty. Among her many siblings, one stood in quiet contrast, her younger sister Hedwig. The two girls often walked together in the gardens, where the scent of herbs from the convent kitchen mingled with the mountain air. Gertrude spoke of power and duty, of the games played in council halls. Hedwig listened, her hands folded before her, her eyes resting on the small chapel at the edge of the courtyard. One evening, as the bells tolled vespers, Hedwig turned to her sister and whispered, "You were born to command, Gertrude, but do not forget that a crown without mercy is a weight that crushes." Gertrude laughed softly, tilting her chin. "Mercy is for those who have no power, little sister. A queen must never tremble. If I am given a throne, it will be because I am strong enough to hold it." Their words revealed the divide between them. Hedwig sought God, humility, the path of cloisters. Gertrude sought the crown, the clash of politics, the authority to shape kingdoms. Yet beneath their differences lay an unshaken bond, a thread of blood and memory that would tie them even when oceans of grief stood between them. When Andrew, the Hungarian prince, chose Gertrude for his bride, it was more than marriage. It was a covenant of power. The girl from the mountains of Bavaria stepped into a world where the crown was heavy, but her shoulders were ready to bear it. She gave Andrew heirs, among them Bela, a boy destined for his own storms. She presided at feasts, her voice carrying across the hall, her authority unmistakable. At first, she seemed untouchable. Chroniclers describe her as luminous, a figure who could calm the noise of a court with a single gesture. But even then, tension coiled beneath the surface. Hungary's nobles watched, their pride bristling at the foreign woman who dared to govern in their tongue, who dared to sign decrees with her own hand. Gertrude did not see their resentment, or perhaps she chose not to. She had been raised to believe that her authority was a right, not a gift. From her earliest years beside Hedwig in the garden, she had been certain of one thing. Her destiny was not to remain a silent queen. Her destiny was to rule. And so she walked deeper into Hungary's halls with her head high, unaware that each step carried her closer to the storm already gathering. The years after Gertrude's arrival in Hungary were filled with triumph. Yet triumph often leaves a bitter aftertaste. When Andrew rode on campaign or journeyed across distant lands, it was Gertrude who held the reins of government. She wore authority like a cloak, and for a time, it seemed to fit her shoulders perfectly. But her vision of rule reached beyond the borders of Hungary. She believed loyalty should be rewarded with power, and for her, loyalty came first from her blood. Her brother Egbert, a man trained for the church, rose swiftly in influence. He was granted the abbacy of Pannonhalma and placed into positions that gave him both wealth and spiritual command. Another brother, Berthold, received the archbishopric of Kalocsa, one of the most powerful offices in the kingdom. Lands and estates once belonging to Hungary's proudest families were parceled out to these foreigners who spoke German among themselves and gathered in her chambers as if Hungary were their inheritance. To the queen, these appointments felt natural. She trusted her kin, for blood could not betray as strangers might. Yet to the Hungarian nobility, it was a humiliation that cut deep. Generations of warriors who had defended the Carpathian Plain watched as their estates shrank and their voices weakened. They muttered that the throne of St. Stephen had become nothing more than a gift for outsiders. In the halls of Buda, whispers grew sharper. Courtiers lowered their heads when Gertrude entered, but in corners their words turned venomous. One lord was heard to sneer, "We kneel not to our king, but to the queen's brothers." Hungary has become the table scraps of Merania. Another answered in a hushed voice, "She gives us no crown, only chains of foreign steel." Gertrude heard fragments of these whispers, yet she brushed them aside. She had lived too long with certainty to believe they could harm her. To her mind, the nobles should learn obedience, as subjects always must. Her gaze remained steady, her decisions swift, her hand firm upon the seal of authority. Still, there were signs even she could not ignore. The feasts grew colder, the songs grew shorter. Where once her presence had commanded admiration, now silence greeted her. When she entered the council chamber, men bowed, but did not meet her eyes. She spoke of treaties and alliances, yet no one offered counsel, only empty assent. She had turned her throne into a solitary seat, surrounded not by advisors but by watchers waiting for her to falter. One autumn evening, as the torches burned low, Gertrude walked the corridors of her palace and paused before a window. The fields outside stretched into darkness, the harvest already gathered. She whispered to herself, almost in defiance, "They will not break me. I am their queen." But beyond the glass, the land lay still, and the silence seemed to answer her with an emptiness more threatening than any shout. The resentment she dismissed was no longer a murmur. It had become a vow, forged in secrecy among nobles whose patience had reached its end. And while Gertrude still believed her crown was secure, Hungary was preparing to show her how fragile even a queen could be. Autumn draped its chill over the forests of Hungary. The leaves had begun to turn, crimson and gold, and the hunting horns of the king sounded in the distance. Andrew was away with his companions, chasing deer across the plains, leaving the court in the hands of the queen. It was in this space of absence that silence thickened, and silence, in Hungary, was never innocent. For months, the nobles had spoken in whispers behind closed doors, but now their plotting took form. The men who had once bowed before Gertrude gathered in the shadows of halls lit only by torches. Their voices were low, but their fury was sharp. "She feeds her kin with our land," one growled, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Another answered, "If the king is blind, then we must act as the eyes of Hungary. Tonight, her reign ends." That evening, the palace seemed unusually tense. Servants moved quickly, avoiding her gaze. The air was heavy, as though the stones themselves waited. Gertrude, wrapped in velvet, entered the hall for the feast. Her children played at her feet, laughter carrying briefly through the chamber. Yet no one else smiled. She raised her cup, her voice calm, but the hall gave back only hollow echoes. The doors closed with a sound like a verdict. Swords were drawn. At first, she did not believe. Queens were not slaughtered in their own halls, not by men sworn to protect them, but as steel glinted in the torchlight, and the faces of nobles she knew twisted with hatred. The truth fell upon her. She stood, her crown slipping slightly, her eyes searching the room. "You would raise your hands against your queen," she demanded, her voice steady though her heart raced. A noble stepped forward, his tone like ice. "You are no queen. You are the thief of Hungary." The first blow struck, shattering the fragile silence. She cried out, not only from pain but from betrayal, the wound cutting deeper into her spirit than into her flesh. Hands seized her, dragging her toward the doorway. She struggled, her silk tearing, her hair loosening, her cries filling the corridor. But no help came. They forced her into the courtyard, the night air biting at her skin. The stars above gave no comfort. The circle of men closed in, their blades flashing like the fangs of wolves. Her final words were not for them, but for God. "If I die, let my son remember me as a queen." The nobles showed no mercy. They cut her down with violence meant not only to kill, but to erase. Some chronicles speak of her body torn apart, piece by piece, until she no longer resembled the woman who had ruled them. What is certain is that she was left broken upon the earth, stripped of dignity, abandoned to the night. The forest beyond the walls remained still. The hunting horns of Andrew echoed faintly in the distance, unaware that while he pursued deer, his queen had been hunted and destroyed. When the hunting horns finally fell silent, the king returned. The forest had yielded its prey, but in the palace, something far darker awaited him. Andrew rode into the courtyard, his cloak heavy with dust, his hounds restless. At first, he noticed only the silence. No songs, no greetings, no laughter of servants. The air was thick, as though every stone carried a secret too heavy to bear. He dismounted, his boots striking against the flagstones. The hall he entered had once glowed with the warmth of his queen's voice. Now the torches flickered weakly, and the scent of wine and blood mingled in the air. At the center lay what remained of Gertrude. Her gown was torn, her hair unbound, her body broken. The Queen of Hungary, the mother of his children, lay abandoned as if she had been nothing. Andrew staggered forward, his hand reaching out, but stopping short. His courtiers watched from the shadows, their faces averted. No one spoke. The silence pressed upon him more heavily than the sight of death itself. For a long moment, he could not breathe. He whispered her name, Gertrude, but she gave no answer. The king demanded to know who had done this, though in truth he already knew. The lords stood nearby, their blades cleaned, their expressions hard and cold. They did not kneel. One of them met his gaze and said with quiet defiance, "Hungary has rid itself of chains." Andrew felt rage ignite, but beneath the fire came fear. To punish them would mean civil war. To avenge his queen would risk the very throne he sat upon. The weight of kingship pressed down upon him, and in that crushing silence he understood the trap. His voice shook as he spoke, not with anger but with resignation. "If I shed blood for hers, more blood will drown this kingdom." That night he remained beside her lifeless form. He touched the fabric of her gown, still damp with violence, and for the first time in many years, his authority seemed powerless. He prayed, though he did not know to whom, asking for forgiveness for a failure he could never admit aloud. His thoughts circled endlessly. Had his absence condemned her? Had his silence after her death chained him to guilt forever? In the days that followed, no grand executions came. A few punishments were whispered, but the men most guilty walked free. Andrew weighed vengeance against survival and chose survival. The court carried on with hollow ceremony, but the people remembered. They saw a king who could not protect his queen, who bowed to the will of nobles that feared her more than they feared him. Gertrude's body was buried with prayers, but the earth did not close over her story. The wound she left behind would shape the kingdom and haunt Andrew until his last breath. At night, he dreamed of her voice, steady and commanding. The same voice that had once steadied his throne. Now it came to him as accusation. The silence he chose after her death became a second betrayal, one that history would not forgive. And in that silence, Gertrude's shadow grew heavier, not weaker, as if even in death she remained the measure of his failure. News of Gertrude's death traveled swiftly across the mountains to Bavaria and beyond. Among the first to hear was her sister Hedwig, now living far from Hungary, wrapped in the discipline of devotion. When the messenger spoke the words, she closed her eyes and pressed her hands together. Not in shock, but in sorrow, too deep for tears. She had once walked the garden paths with Gertrude, had once warned her that crowns without mercy weigh heavily. Now that warning felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Hedwig's grief did not turn to anger. Instead, she turned to prayer, her voice lifting in chapels filled with cold light. She begged that her sister's soul be received not as the body of a disgraced queen, but as the spirit of a woman who had borne the burden of rule. To those around her, Hedwig whispered that silence was also guilt. "A sister cannot speak for her in the grave," she said, "but I can speak to heaven until heaven remembers her name." In Hungary, the memory of Gertrude began to shift into legend. Peasants whispered that on certain nights, the forests echoed with the cry of a hunted beast. Though no hunter was near, They said the queen's spirit wandered where she had been dragged, calling out not for vengeance but for recognition. Some believed her ghost walked with a crown of thorns, as if the kingdom itself had crowned her suffering. Andrew, meanwhile, carried his own torment. By day he spoke little of her. He moved through the halls as if nothing had happened, yet those closest to him felt the weight in his eyes. At night he lingered in the chapel alone, his voice breaking in prayer. "I failed you," he murmured before the altar, his words swallowed by the flicker of candles. "I chose the throne over your blood. Forgive me if forgiveness can be found." He punished a few conspirators, but his hand never struck the leaders who had ordered her death. He justified it as prudence, yet in truth it was fear. He feared rebellion more than he feared shame. His restraint became a second wound, one that made Gertrude's death seem unavenged. Hedwig's efforts reached further than prayer. She worked quietly to preserve her sister's dignity in memory. She told monks and nuns that Gertrude had been misunderstood, that her strength had been mistaken for pride, her loyalty to family mistaken for greed. In Hedwig's words, the queen became more than the victim of a conspiracy. She became a soul broken by envy, a woman whose power had been too much for the men around her to endure. Time did not silence the whispers. In villages, mothers warned their daughters of the fate of the queen, teaching them that greatness could summon both admiration and hatred. In monasteries, prayers rose for her soul, carried by Hedwig's persistent devotion. And in the king's own heart, the silence grew heavier with each passing year. Gertrude was gone, yet she remained everywhere. In forests where peasants feared to walk at night, in chapels where candles were lit for her soul, in the restless mind of a king who chose survival over justice, and most of all, in the prayers of a sister who refused to let her be forgotten. Years passed, yet Gertrude's presence never left Hungary. Though her body had been laid beneath stone, the land itself seemed unwilling to let her rest. Travelers spoke of nights when the wind rushed through the forests like the cry of a wounded animal. Others swore that in the courtyards of Buda, the faint rustle of silk could be heard, as if a queen still walked among the torches. She had been cut down, but she had not been erased. Her children grew beneath the shadow of her absence. Bela, the son who would one day wear the crown, carried her memory like an invisible scar. He remembered not the politics that condemned her, but the sound of her voice in the hall, the steadiness of her hand upon his shoulder. For him, her death was not history but a wound, one that shaped the way he saw power, one that taught him that a crown might protect a kingdom yet could not protect a mother. In the monasteries, her sister Hedwig continued to pray. With every candle she lit, with every psalm she whispered, Gertrude's name was spoken into eternity. When Hedwig was later revered as a saint, those who remembered connected her holiness to the queen she had lost. One sister sought heaven through humility. The other had been devoured by the wolves of politics. Yet together they became two halves of a story that would echo through generations. For the nobles who struck her down, her death was meant to silence. Instead, it became a question that history refused to answer. Was she guilty of arrogance, or was she punished simply for being a foreign queen who dared to rule? Was her power excessive, or was it only the reflection of a woman stronger than the men who surrounded her? No chronicle has resolved this. The image remains, a queen pulled from her seat, a crown falling, a body left broken beneath the stars. Gertrude's tragedy lingers as a reminder that power does not shield against hatred, and that silence, whether chosen or forced, can be more destructive than a sword. Her husband chose silence, and that silence condemned him as much as her killers. Her son carried silence, and it forged his reign. Her sister broke silence with prayer, and in that prayer, Gertrude's spirit was preserved. In the end, she became more than a victim. She became a symbol of how thin the veil of majesty truly is, how easily a throne can collapse into blood and shadow. The forest where she fell is long quiet, yet the soil remembers, the stones remember, and those who listen can still hear the echo of her last defiance, a queen refusing to be nothing. History is filled with rulers and battles, but within it lie stories like Gertrude's, stories that demand to be spoken aloud, stories that remind us that crowns are fragile and that vengeance leaves wounds which never close. If her tale has gripped you, if the image of a hunted queen stays with you, then do not let it fade into silence. Share this story, carry it forward, and let others see the truths that history tried to bury. And if you wish to walk further into the darkest chambers of the past, subscribe now. Here, the dead will speak again, and their voices will not be ignored.